There's a reason 12 of the wealthiest families in Robertson County, Tennessee changed their surnames between 1847 and 1860. 12 families who had controlled the county's courts, banks, and land for over 20 years suddenly wanted nothing to do with their own names. They scattered across 4 states, some moving as far as Texas and Missouri, desperate to escape something that had happened in the autumn of 1847. What they were running from wasn't a plague, wasn't a war, wasn't a financial collapse. It was a woman. Her name was Eliza Harwell, and she was born with one blue eye and one brown eye, a condition so unusual that people in 1824 believed it meant she could see things others couldn't. But what destroyed those 12 families had nothing to do with superstition. It had everything to do with what Eliza actually witnessed over 23 years, what she understood about how power really worked in Tennessee, and what she did with that knowledge when she finally got the chance. They called it a curse. The newspapers called it the Springfield Scandal. Before we continue with how one woman brought down 12 of the most powerful men in Middle Tennessee, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. And if you want more dark stories from American history that sound impossible but actually happened, subscribe and hit that notification bell. You're going to want to hear every detail of this. What makes this story so disturbing isn't that Eliza Harwell had any special power. It's that she had something these men never expected an enslaved woman to have. Access to their secrets, the intelligence to understand what those secrets meant, and eventually the opportunity to speak. Robertson County, Tennessee, in 1824 was a landscape of contradictions. The tobacco fields stretched green and profitable under summer suns, while the Cumberland River wound through valleys where Cherokee families had lived for generations before being pushed westward. The county seat of Springfield had grown prosperous on the backs of forced labor, its courthouse and merchants' homes speaking to wealth built on human suffering that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. The soil was rich, the growing season favorable, and by the 1820s, Robertson County had established itself as one of the more prosperous agricultural regions in Middle Tennessee. Tobacco was king, but cotton was gaining ground, and the men who controlled the land controlled everything else: the courts, the banks, the political offices, the future itself. The Harwell plantation sat on 800 acres of prime bottomland, managed by Colonel James Harwell, a man whose reputation balanced precariously between respected landowner and something darker whispered about in quarters where enslaved people gathered after the work bells fell silent. Harwell had inherited the property from his father in 1819 and had spent 5 years expanding both his holdings and his influence. He served as a county magistrate, maintained friendships with Tennessee's political elite, and hosted gatherings where deals were made that never appeared in official records. The plantation itself was impressive by regional standards. The main house was a 2-story structure of brick and timber with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze. Behind it stretched the working heart of the operation: the tobacco barns, the curing sheds, the blacksmith's forge, the weaving house, and the 2 rows of cabins where the enslaved population lived. 73 people worked the Harwell land in 1824, their labor generating wealth that flowed upward to the big house and outward to the banks and merchants of Springfield. On a March morning in 1824, a child was born in the cabin row behind the main house. The midwife, an elderly woman named Ruth, who delivered 3 generations of babies both enslaved and free, had seen many things in her 70 years. She'd seen breech births and twins, stillbirths and miracles, children who came into the world screaming and children who arrived silent as snowfall. But she'd never seen eyes like the ones that looked up at her from the infant girl child she placed in her mother's arms. One eye was pale gray-blue, luminous as a winter sky reflected in water. The other was deep brown, almost black in certain lights. The condition had a medical name, heterochromia iridis, though few in Robertson County would have known the term. What they knew were the stories, the superstitions, the fearful certainty that such a mark meant something. Ruth held her tongue for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Child got different eyes," she said, her voice neutral. "Seen it once before, long time ago. That child lived to be old. Nothing wrong with her, just different." But Sarah, the child's mother, saw the way Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the baby in clean cloth. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in the old woman's face, the quick glance toward the door as if checking who might be listening. Sarah was 24 years old, had survived the Middle Passage as a child, and had learned to read the subtle languages of fear and danger that governed plantation life. The child's mother held her daughter close and made a decision in that moment that would shape everything to come. She named the girl Eliza, a name she'd heard from the mistress's Bible readings, a strong name that sounded like it belonged to someone who mattered, and she resolved to raise her as normally as possible, despite the stares and whispers that would inevitably follow. For the first 6 years of Eliza's life, that plan worked reasonably well. Children in the quarters accepted her easily enough, fascinated by her eyes, but unbothered once the novelty faded. They played the same games, shared the same meager meals, learned the same lessons about survival and silence that all enslaved children learned. The white children who glimpsed her kept their distance, warned by parents who'd filled their heads with folk beliefs about mismatched eyes, bringing bad fortune or marking those who could see spirits. But Eliza herself was developing traits that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with her particular mind. She could hear a story once and repeat it back word for word a week later. She could recall with perfect clarity conversations she'd overheard years before. She noticed patterns that others missed, remembered faces and names and connections with an accuracy that was, at first, merely impressive to those who noticed. Her mother Sarah recognized it early. By age 4, Eliza could recite entire songs after hearing them once. By 5, she could describe in detail events that had happened 2 years prior, remembering not just what happened but who was present, what they wore, what the weather was like. By 6, she'd begun to understand that this gift made her different in ways that went beyond her unusual eyes. As she grew older, it became something else entirely. The summer of 1830 brought a drought that left the tobacco yellowing in the fields and tempers running short across Robertson County. The Cumberland River dropped to levels that exposed rocks and sandbars that hadn't been visible in living memory. Crops struggled. Enslaved people worked longer hours trying to save what could be saved, hauling water from increasingly distant sources while the sun beat down merciless and unrelenting. Eliza was 6 years old, recently assigned to work in the main house under the supervision of Martha, the head housekeeper who'd served the Harwell family for 30 years. Martha was a woman of quiet authority, respected by both the enslaved community and the white family she served. She'd learned to navigate the impossible terrain of plantation life, understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, when to push back and when to submit, surviving through a combination of intelligence, diplomacy, and carefully cultivated usefulness. It was Martha who first recognized what made Eliza different, not her eyes, which had lost their novelty through familiarity, but her memory. The child heard instructions once and executed them perfectly days later. She could recall which guests had visited 3 weeks prior, what they'd eaten, what they'd discussed while she cleared their plates. She knew which cabinet held which dishes without being told twice, could recite the entire week's menu after hearing the cook plan it once on Monday morning, remembered the names of people she'd met only briefly months before. Martha watched this with growing concern. She'd seen enough of plantation life to understand that intelligence in enslaved people was simultaneously valued and feared, useful enough to exploit, dangerous enough to suppress. A child who appeared too smart, too observant, too capable of understanding the mechanisms of power around her was a child in danger. One evening in late July, after the household had settled and most people were asleep, Martha sought out Sarah in the quarters. They spoke in whispers, their voices barely audible over the chorus of crickets and tree frogs. "That child remembers too much," Martha said, her voice low and urgent. I watch her. She hears something once, she got it forever. I seen her tell Miss Harwell about a conversation from 2 weeks back, remembered every word exact. That kind of thing noticed. Sarah's heart clenched with fear she'd been carrying since Eliza's birth. What you saying I should do? Teach her to forget things, Martha said. Or at least pretend to. Teach her to act confused when she understand perfectly. Make her ask for instructions twice even when she heard them clear the first time. She need to seem ordinary, or she gonna draw attention she don't want. Sarah understood immediately. An enslaved person who appeared too intelligent, too observant, was a threat to the system that required them to be seen as inferior, as naturally suited to servitude, as incapable of the higher reasoning that justified their bondage. Intelligence had to be hidden, dulled, made invisible. She began teaching Eliza the difficult art of appearing less capable than she was. It was a bitter lesson, training her daughter to diminish herself, but Sarah knew it might save her life. But some things couldn't be hidden, and some things, once seen, couldn't be unseen. On an August evening when the heat sat thick as wet wool over the plantation, Colonel Harwell hosted a dinner for 11 of his associates. They were men of influence who arrived in carriages that kicked up dust on the long drive to the main house. Plantation owners from neighboring counties, a state representative whose district included Robertson County, 2 judges who presided over regional courts, several merchants who financed tobacco operations through credit and loans, and a land speculator named Edward Vance, whose wealth came from sources that weren't discussed in polite company. The dining room had been prepared meticulously. Martha had overseen every detail, the china arranged just so, the silver polished until it gleamed in candlelight, the linens pressed and spotless. The food was elaborate by rural Tennessee standards: roasted pork and chicken, corn pudding, greens cooked with fatback, fresh bread, fruit preserves, and pies made with the last of the previous year's dried apples. Eliza, small enough to be easily overlooked, moved through the dining room refilling water glasses and removing empty plates. Martha had positioned her there deliberately, knowing the child's memory and hoping she'd simply blend into the background. The men had been drinking heavily, bourbon flowing freely as the evening progressed, their voices growing louder, their words less guarded with each passing hour. Eliza heard Edward Vance boasting about a recent acquisition, his voice thick with satisfaction and alcohol. Bought the Fuller property for 1/3 of its value. The widow never knew her husband had signed over the deed as collateral 3 years ago, documentation I happened to acquire through appropriate channels. By the time she figured it out, the foreclosure was final. Couldn't have worked more perfectly if I'd planned it myself. She heard Judge Thornton laugh, a sound without humor, as he described dismissing a case brought by a freed black man named Isaac, who was trying to reclaim his 3 children. The children had been sold before Isaac's manumission papers were finalized, and he'd spent 2 years working to earn enough money to buy them back, only to discover they'd been sold separately to buyers in 3 different counties. Couldn't let that precedent stand, Judge Thornton explained, gesturing with his glass. Man brings a case like that, wins it. Next thing you know, every one of them would be flooding the courts with similar claims. Have to maintain order, maintain the system. I dismissed it on technical grounds, improper filing procedures. He didn't have representation, of course, couldn't afford it, made it simple enough. The other men nodded appreciatively, understanding the implications. The law existed not for justice, but for maintaining power structures that benefited them. She heard Colonel Harwell himself discussing a plan to manipulate the county assessor into undervaluing certain properties along the Cumberland River bottomland, making them vulnerable to acquisition by what he called our consortium. The plan involved a complex scheme of coordinated low-ball offers, manufactured debts, and strategic foreclosures that would transfer prime farmland from struggling small farmers to the men in this room. And she heard something else, something that made her pause with a water pitcher frozen in her small hands, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. The men were discussing a woman named Grace Thornhill, a free woman of color who owned 40 acres of prime farmland just outside Springfield. She'd inherited it from her white father, a respected merchant who'd freed her mother and their 3 children in his will and left them property that should have secured their future. Grace Thornhill had refused multiple offers to sell the land. She'd built a successful small farm operation, growing vegetables and raising chickens, supplying Springfield's market with produce that was known for its quality. She'd done everything right, followed every law, paid every tax, maintained her freedom papers with meticulous care. The conversation turned to speculation about how unfortunate it would be if questions arose about the legitimacy of her father's will, questions that Marcus Pettiford, an attorney who specialized in property disputes, might be positioned to raise. Or if her free papers were discovered to have irregularities, small technical problems that Judge Thornton might be obligated to address in his court. Or if her property happened to be subject to liens or debts that Edward Vance might happen to hold documentation for. These things resolve themselves, Colonel Harwell said, his voice casual as if discussing the weather, as if discussing whether to plant tobacco or cotton in the North Field. With appropriate pressure applied in appropriate places. She'll sell eventually, or circumstances will create opportunities for acquisition through other means. The woman has no family support, no legal representation she can afford, no real protection. It's simply a matter of patience and coordination. The other men murmured agreement, already moving on to discuss other business, other opportunities for profitable coordination. Eliza stood motionless, the heavy pitcher still in her hands, watching these men who held the power of life and death, prosperity and ruin over everyone in Robertson County. She was 6 years old, but she understood with sudden terrible clarity exactly what she was hearing. These men were planning to destroy Grace Thornhill, to take everything she'd built, everything her father had left her, simply because they wanted her land and had the power to take it. 2 months later, on a cold October night, Grace Thornhill's farmhouse burned to the ground. She died in the fire, trapped in a structure that neighbors later said seemed to burn with unusual speed and intensity. Her land was sold at auction 3 weeks after her death to pay debts that appeared in court records with remarkable speed, debts documented with papers that Marcus Pettiford filed and Judge Thornton validated without question. Edward Vance purchased the property for less than half its actual value. The Springfield newspaper ran a brief notice about the tragic fire, expressing sympathy for the loss of a respected member of the community, making no mention of the convenient timing or suspicious circumstances. Eliza was 6 years old, but she remembered every word spoken that August evening. She remembered the names, the connections, the casual cruelty of men who believed they operated above consequence. She remembered Judge Thornton's laugh and Edward Vance's satisfaction, and Colonel Harwell's calm assurance that these things resolve themselves. She remembered Marcus Pettiford nodding thoughtfully, already calculating how he'd manufacture the legal justification for what they were planning, and she began to understand something that would shape the next 17 years of her life, something that would determine the course of events that would eventually destroy 12 families and reshape Robertson County's power structure. Power wasn't just about ownership and law, it was about information, leverage, and knowing things that powerful men wanted to keep hidden. It was about remembering when everyone else was paid or threatened into forgetting. It was about bearing witness when witness was supposed to be impossible. Eliza Harwell, at 6 years old, had become an unintentional archive of corruption. And though she didn't yet know what to do with that knowledge, she knew with perfect certainty that someday it would matter. Someday, these men who spoke so freely in her presence would regret their assumption that enslaved people were no more capable of meaningful memory than the furniture they moved around. Someday she would speak, and when she did, everything these men had built would burn, not with fire like Grace Thornhill's farmhouse, but with something far more destructive. The truth. Sombras do Pasado. From 1830 to 1838, Eliza Harwell grew from a child into a young woman, and her memory became something that concerned those who noticed it. The years passed with the grinding consistency of plantation life, planting seasons and harvest seasons, tobacco crops that succeeded and occasional crops that failed. People born and people dying. The constant underlying tension of a system built on violence and control. Martha, the head housekeeper who'd first recognized Eliza's gift and warned her mother about it, died in the winter of 1833. She'd caught pneumonia during a cold snap that froze the Cumberland River solid for 3 days, and despite her value to the Harwell household, she received only minimal medical attention. She was buried in the section of the plantation designated for enslaved people. Her grave marked with a simple wooden cross that would weather and disappear within a few years. Before she died, Martha called Eliza to her bedside. The girl was 9 years old, already working full days in the main house, already learning to navigate the dangerous currents of plantation politics. "You got a gift," Martha whispered, her breath labored and painful. "But gifts can be curses if you don't careful. You remember everything, but you got to learn what to say and what to keep silent. Some things, you speak them too soon, you die with them. Some things, you wait, you watch, you learn when the time right. You understand?" Eliza nodded, holding the old woman's cold hand. "Promise me you'll be smart," Martha said. "Smart enough to survive until you can be free. Don't let them break you, and don't let them kill you with your own gift." It was the last conversation they had. Martha died that night, taking her warnings and her wisdom to the grave. Sarah, Eliza's mother, tried her best to keep her daughter safe through obscurity, but Eliza's unusual eyes made obscurity impossible. The plantation owners and merchants who visited the Harwell house took note of the young woman with mismatched eyes who moved through rooms silently, efficiently, remembering everything. Some found it unsettling, crossing themselves or averting their gaze when she looked directly at them. Old superstitions about evil eyes and second sight, making them uncomfortable. Others found it useful, a curiosity to comment on, a convenient way to remember which servant was which. By 1835, Colonel Harwell had begun deliberately stationing Eliza in rooms where he held sensitive conversations. He'd discovered, through testing her, that she could recall exact quotes from discussions held weeks prior. It became a game to him at first, a parlor trick he'd demonstrate for guests. He'd ask her to recount what Judge Thornton had said about a particular land case 2 weeks ago, and she'd repeat the conversation verbatim, including the judge's exact phrasing and the specific legal precedents he'd mentioned. The guests would express amazement, would speculate about her unusual ability, would wonder if her distinctive eyes somehow related to her distinctive memory. Colonel Harwell would accept their compliments on owning such an interesting specimen, would laugh about how useful it was to have a living record of his business dealings. What Colonel Harwell didn't realize was that Eliza had begun keeping track of everything she heard, organizing it in her mind like a vast ledger of transactions, betrayals, and secrets. She knew which debts were real and which were fabricated to justify foreclosures. She knew which court cases had been decided before they were officially heard, judges receiving instructions from the men who controlled Robertson County's economy. She knew which property deeds had been altered, which wills had been influenced through pressure or promises, which marriages had been arranged primarily for financial advantage rather than affection. And she knew something else, something that would eventually prove to be the key to everything that followed. She knew the connections between the 12 men who regularly gathered at the Harwell plantation, the web of mutual interest and coordinated manipulation that allowed them to control Robertson County completely. They called themselves the Springfield Association, though no such organization existed in any official record, no charter filed with the state, no membership list kept in any courthouse. It was an informal arrangement, the kind that powerful men have always made, coordinating their interests to multiply their individual power. There was Colonel James Harwell himself, the host and coordinator, whose plantation provided neutral ground for their meetings and whose position as county magistrate gave him legal authority to facilitate their plans. There was Judge Benjamin Thornton, who presided over the circuit court that covered Robertson and 3 neighboring counties, whose rulings ensured that legal challenges to association interests were dismissed or decided in their favor. There was Edward Vance, the land speculator whose wealth came from buying distressed properties at fraction of their value. often distress that had been carefully manufactured by other association members. There was Robert Killebrew, who owned 300 acres and 60 enslaved people just north of Springfield, whose political connections in Nashville provided advance warning of legislative changes that might affect land values or agricultural markets. There was Samuel Batson, whose cotton gin operation supplied half the county and whose monopoly on cotton processing allowed him to set rates and payment terms that kept smaller farmers perpetually indebted to him. There was William Greer, who controlled the county land office and had access to all property records, surveyor reports, and title information, making him invaluable for identifying vulnerable properties and manufacturing documentation when needed. There was Thomas Whitley, whose mercantile in Springfield extended credit that kept smaller farmers trapped in cycles of debt, their crop yields pledged before they were even planted, their land serving as collateral for loans they could never fully repay. There was Jefferson Cunningham, who operated the county's only bank and controlled access to the capital necessary for any significant business venture, his loan approval or denial capable of making or destroying financial plans. There was Henry Cartwright, who owned the largest tobacco warehouse in Robertson County, where farmers brought their crops for storage and sale, where his control of grading and pricing could dramatically affect a farmer's annual income. There was Daniel Yateman, whose family had held political office for 3 generations, currently serving in the state legislature, providing the association with influence in Nashville and advanced knowledge of upcoming legislation or political appointments. There was Marcus Pettiford, whose legal practice specialized in property disputes, contract law, and estate settlements, capable of creating legal complications or resolving them depending on who he was working for. And there was Alexander Darden, who managed the slave auction house in Springfield, where human beings were bought and sold, where families were separated and lives were reduced to inventory, where the association members could coordinate purchases to suppress competition and control prices. These 12 men controlled Robertson County's economy and legal system through careful coordination and mutual support. They enriched each other through shared information and coordinated action. They destroyed anyone who threatened their interests, using courts and contracts and carefully applied pressure rather than violence. Though violence was available when necessary, applied through intermediaries who couldn't be connected back to them. They did all of this while maintaining reputations as respectable citizens, church deacons, family men who attended Sunday services and contributed to local charities and spoke eloquently about honor and tradition and the proper ordering of society. Eliza knew all of this because she'd heard them plan it, celebrate it, refine their methods over hundreds of conversations they'd held in the belief that enslaved people in the room were no more capable of meaningful memory or understanding than the furniture they arranged or the food they served. In 1838, something changed in Colonel Harwell's utilization of Eliza's abilities. Whether out of arrogance or genuine curiosity, or simply increasing confidence in her usefulness, he began asking her more direct questions about what she'd heard. At first they were simple tests, verification of details he already knew but wanted confirmed. Then they became something else entirely. He wanted her to tell him exactly what Robert Killebrew had said about a boundary dispute with a neighboring property owner, word for word, so he could understand Killebrew's actual position versus what he'd claimed publicly. He wanted to know exactly how much money Thomas Whitley had mentioned lending to a particular farmer, because the numbers Whitley was reporting to the association didn't match with what he'd said in casual conversation. He wanted to recall exactly which properties Edward Vance had expressed interest in acquiring during various discussions, so he could potentially acquire them first, or partner with Vance on more favorable terms. Colonel Harwell, in other words, was using Eliza's memory to gain advantage over his own associates. The association was built on mutual benefit, but Harwell had begun to see opportunities to benefit slightly more than the others, to position himself as first among equals, to consolidate his position as the central coordinator whose information access made him indispensable. And Eliza realized that her unusual gift had given her something unprecedented in her powerless position, value beyond her labor. She began to understand that information was a form of power that could, perhaps, be turned into something else. Something like leverage. Something, eventually, like freedom. Freedom was a word that enslaved people learned to say only in their minds. A hope that burned quietly in the chest where white people couldn't see it, nurtured in private moments and protected through silence. But Eliza began to imagine a path toward it. One conversation at a time, one remembered secret at a time, one careful observation after another, building toward something she couldn't yet fully envision, but knew existed somewhere in the distance. What she didn't yet know was how high the cost would be, or how many people would be destroyed in the process, or that the destruction would include not just the 12 men of the Springfield Association, but their families, their descendants, their carefully constructed legacies that would be reduced to ash and scandal, and names that people change to escape from. The path to freedom, when you're starting from the bottom of a system designed to keep you there forever, requires a willingness to tear down the entire structure. And Eliza Harwell, though she couldn't have articulated it at 14 years old, was beginning to understand that tearing down structures was exactly what would be required. The year 1841 marked a turning point, though no one recognized it at the time. Colonel Harwell's health had begun to decline, a persistent cough that the county doctor attributed to years of tobacco dust and the humid Tennessee climate. The cough grew worse through the winter, accompanied by chest pains and difficulty breathing. By spring, it was clear that Colonel Harwell's time as head of the plantation and leader of the Springfield Association was coming to an end. His son, James Harwell Jr., who'd been studying law in Nashville for 3 years, returned home to prepare for eventually taking over the plantation. James Jr. was 26 years old, ambitious and educated, but he possessed his father's hunger for power without his father's patience or caution. He'd grown up watching the association operate, understanding the mechanisms of control, but not fully appreciating the delicate balance required to maintain them. Eliza, now 17 years old, watched the younger Harwell with careful attention. She'd learned to read men's characters through observation, understanding their weaknesses and motivations through the unguarded moments when they thought no one important was watching. James Jr. was desperate to prove himself worthy of inheriting not just the plantation, but his father's position in the association. That desperation made him reckless. The younger Harwell began hosting more frequent gatherings, trying to establish himself as a worthy successor. The 12 men of the association attended these meetings with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some, like Judge Thornton and Edward Vance, were supportive, seeing in James Jr. a continuation of profitable arrangements. Others, like Robert Killebrew and Jefferson Cunningham, were skeptical, questioning whether someone so young and untested could maintain the coordination and discretion that had made the association successful for nearly 2 decades. This meant more conversations for Eliza to overhear, more secrets to catalog in her perfect memory. But it also meant something more dangerous. James Jr. was beginning to discuss her, to talk about her unusual abilities in ways his father never had. The conversation that changed everything happened in the plantation office on a cold February evening in 1843. James Jr. had invited Edward Vance and Marcus Pettiford to discuss expansion of their operations. Colonel Harwell was bedridden upstairs, his cough so severe that he could barely speak, his authority already slipping away as death approached. "The girl's memory is remarkable," James Jr. said, gesturing toward Eliza, who stood in the corner of the room, ostensibly waiting to refill drinks, but actually listening to every word. "Better than any written record, because there's nothing to find, nothing to burn if questions arise. I've been thinking we could lease her services to other members when they need reliable record-keeping for transactions we can't commit to paper." Edward Vance, older and more cynical, shook his head slowly. "You're talking about teaching a slave to understand she has value beyond her labor. That's dangerous territory, James. Your father understood that. He used her, yes, but he never let her know she was valuable, never gave her reason to think she had leverage." Marcus Pettiford, the attorney who'd drafted countless fraudulent documents for the association, added quietly, "She already understands. Look at her eyes. She's listening to every word we're saying right now." She's been listening for years. The question isn't whether she understands her value. The question is what she plans to do with that knowledge. James Jr. laughed, a sound that carried more bravado than confidence. She's property. Understanding doesn't change that. She can know she's valuable, can even know secrets that would damage us. But what can she do? Who would believe her testimony? Who would give her a platform to speak? The system protects us completely. But Eliza had already learned something crucial from that conversation, something that Marcus Pettiford had inadvertently revealed through his concern. The Springfield Association feared written evidence of their dealings. For nearly 20 years, they'd been meticulous about keeping their most damaging transactions out of official records, relying on private agreements and verbal understandings that couldn't be subpoenaed or used against them in court. What they didn't realize was that Eliza had become their unintentional archive, holding in her memory everything they'd been so careful not to write down. Every fraudulent deed transfer, every manipulated court case, every coordinated foreclosure, every destroyed life and stolen property, all of it recorded in perfect detail in the mind of a young woman they dismissed as incapable of using that information against them. Over the next 2 years, as Colonel Harwell slowly died and James Jr. gradually assumed control, Eliza's role in the household expanded in ways that increased both her access and her danger. James Jr., against the advice of older association members, began using her more openly. She was present during negotiations, during planning sessions, during the casual conversations where the 12 men discussed their ongoing manipulation of county affairs. She heard Samuel Batson describe in precise detail how he was systematically underpaying farmers for their cotton, using rigged scales and creative accounting to skim profits that should have gone to the farmers who grew the crop. He knew they had no alternative gin within 20 miles, knew they were trapped by geography and debt, knew they'd accept whatever payment he offered because they had no choice. She heard Jefferson Cunningham explain with barely concealed pride how he'd structured certain loans to ensure foreclosure was inevitable, setting repayment schedules that were impossible to meet, charging interest rates that compounded faster than crops could be sold, building in technical requirements that gave him legal justification to call loans due whenever strategically useful. She heard Daniel Yateman boast about a political opponent whose reputation he'd destroyed through carefully planted rumors about financial impropriety and moral failings. The rumors were entirely fabricated, but Yateman had coordinated them through multiple sources, making them appear credible through repetition and strategic timing. The opponent had withdrawn from the race, his career ended, his name permanently tainted. The opponent had withdrawn from the race, his political career ended before it truly began. She heard Colonel Harwell's will being contested by his daughter Catherine, who'd married a Methodist minister against her father's wishes in 1836 and been effectively disowned. Catherine lived in Nashville with her husband and 3 children, struggling financially while her brother prepared to inherit everything. She filed a legal challenge in Robertson County Court in March 1843, claiming her father had been mentally incompetent when he revised his will in 1840 to leave the entire estate to James Jr. The Springfield Association couldn't allow that challenge to succeed. Marcus Pettiford handled the legal maneuvering, filing counter-arguments that questioned Catherine's standing and motivations. Judge Thornton ensured the case was assigned to himself rather than a visiting judge from another circuit. Witnesses were prepared, 7 men willing to testify under oath that Colonel Harwell had been completely lucid and competent until his death in February 1843. The hearing lasted 1 day. Catherine's attorney, a young Nashville lawyer working partially pro bono, was outmaneuvered at every turn. Judge Thornton ruled against Catherine in a written decision that cited multiple precedents, all legitimate, all carefully selected to support the predetermined outcome. The will stood. James Jr. inherited approximately $47,000 in property and assets, equivalent to over $1 million in later valuations. Catherine Harwell Morrison died in 1851 in Nashville, still poor, still bitter about what she knew was a stolen inheritance but could never prove. Eliza had heard the association plan every detail of Catherine's defeat. She knew which witnesses had been paid, knew what Judge Thornton had been promised in exchange for his ruling, knew exactly how the legal arguments had been coordinated weeks before the hearing officially began. But what she'd begun to notice was something the association members themselves seemed to overlook. Their coordination, their mutual dependence, had become their structural weakness. Each man's secrets were entangled with the others. The documentation for Edward Vance's fraudulent property acquisitions had been prepared by Marcus Pettiford and validated in Judge Thornton's court using county records accessed through William Greer. The loans that Jefferson Cunningham issued were secured by crop sales through Henry Cartwright's warehouse and processed through Samuel Batson's gin. The political cover that Daniel Yateman provided in Nashville depended on financial support from all 12 members. Expose one thread and the entire web became visible. Destroy one man's credibility and questions would naturally extend to his associates. It was a system that worked perfectly as long as it remained hidden, but was extraordinarily vulnerable once examined. Eliza was 20 years old in 1844. She was enslaved, legally considered property worth approximately $900 on the open market based on her age, health, and capabilities. She was powerless in every way that Tennessee law recognized, but she knew things that could destroy 12 of the most powerful men in Middle Tennessee. She knew exact dates, specific amounts, precise quotes, verifiable details. She knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically, and in at least 2 cases literally, though those details would never make it into official court records. The question was what to do with that knowledge, and whether the cost of using it would be survivable. In the spring of 1844, James Harwell Jr. made a disastrous investment that accelerated everything. He'd been approached by a cotton speculator from Memphis with a proposal to invest in cotton futures, essentially betting on price increases expected due to potential crop failures being reported from Georgia and South Carolina. The speculator had impressive credentials, claimed inside knowledge from Charleston factors, presented documentation that looked legitimate. James Jr. invested $8,000 of plantation funds. He also convinced 3 other association members to invest. Robert Killebrew put in $5,000, Samuel Batson invested $3,000, and Edward Vance contributed $4,000. The total investment of $20,000 represented significant capital, even for men of their wealth. The speculation scheme collapsed in August when it was revealed that the crop failure reports had been exaggerated, possibly fabricated, by the Memphis speculator who'd taken money from multiple investors and disappeared. Criminal charges were filed, but the man was never located. The investors lost everything, $20,000 gone, the equivalent of 15 years' profit from a mid-sized plantation. The loss itself was damaging enough, but the real destruction came from what it revealed about James Jr.'s judgment and the tensions it created within the association. Robert Killebrew, who'd lost the most, was furious. He'd invested based on James Jr. as assurances, based on trust in the Harwell name and assumption that James Jr. had verified the opportunity as thoroughly as his father would have. The Springfield Association's unity, which had seemed unshakable for nearly 20 years, began showing visible fractures. Meetings at the Harwell plantation grew tense, voices raised in ways that would have been unthinkable when Colonel Harwell was alive. Samuel Batson demanded immediate repayment from plantation funds. Edward Vance suggested James Jr. sell portions of the property to cover the losses. Robert Killebrew made barely concealed threats about exposing certain shared arrangements if he wasn't made whole. Eliza watched these confrontations with careful attention, understanding that crisis creates opportunity. The association was weakening. Trust was breaking down. Self-interest was overwhelming mutual benefit, and James Jr., desperate and cornered, made the decision that would ultimately destroy everything. He decided to sell Eliza, The decision came in October 1844 after a particularly heated association meeting where Robert Killebrew had explicitly stated that if James Jr. couldn't manage his own finances, perhaps he couldn't be trusted to coordinate their collective interests. The implicit threat was clear. The association might withdraw support, might even become hostile if James Jr. didn't restore confidence. James Jr. needed money immediately, but more than that, he needed to eliminate a vulnerability that Marcus Pettiford had pointed out months earlier. Eliza knew too much. She'd been present for too many conversations, had heard too many details about operations that couldn't survive scrutiny. As long as she was in Robertson County, she was a potential threat. The solution was to sell her, not locally where buyers would know about her unusual memory and distinctive eyes, but south to Mississippi or Louisiana, to a market where she'd be just another young house servant, where her capabilities would go unrecognized, where she'd be absorbed into a large plantation operation and effectively disappear. James Jr. contacted a slave trader named William Hatcher, who operated between Nashville and Natchez. Hatcher agreed to transport Eliza south as part of a coffle scheduled to depart in mid-July 1845. The price agreed upon was $950, slightly above market rate, with Hatcher understanding that the sale needed to happen quietly, without advertising or public auction. Eliza learned about the sale in November. She overheard James Jr. discussing it with Thomas Whitley, explaining his reasoning, the strategic value of removing a potential liability. The sale was 8 months away. She had that long to find an alternative. 8 months to somehow secure her freedom despite having no money, no legal standing, no obvious allies, and no realistic pathway under Tennessee law. The impossibility of the situation would have crushed most people. But Eliza had spent 20 years watching powerful men manipulate systems, exploit weaknesses, and achieve things that seemed impossible through careful planning and strategic leverage. She began planning with the same methodical attention that the Springfield Association applied to their schemes. First, she needed to learn to write. Reading had come naturally over years of proximity to books and documents in the Harwell house, but writing required practice, required materials, required privacy. She began using charcoal on wooden boards that could be wiped clean, practicing letter formation in the early morning hours before the household woke. She formed letters in dirt outside the cabins that could be smoothed away instantly. She traced words in ash on the hearthstones in the kitchen house, developing the fine motor control needed for legible handwriting. By March 1845, she could write clearly enough to compose a simple letter. Second, she needed an intermediary, someone with enough credibility and independence to potentially help her, someone who wasn't part of the Robertson County power structure that the association controlled. The opportunity arrived in late May, when Reverend Thomas Walsh came to Springfield for a week of revival services. Walsh was a circuit preacher based in Nashville, known for passionate sermons about moral corruption and Christian duty. He'd built a reputation across Middle Tennessee, drawing large crowds and making connections with politicians, journalists, and reformers in Nashville who were increasingly critical of slavery and the political power of plantation owners. Walsh stayed, as such preachers customarily did, with prominent families who could afford to host him. He spent 3 nights at the Harwell plantation, arriving on a Tuesday evening and departing Friday morning. On Wednesday night, Eliza did something that required timing, nerve, and enormous risk. She'd been assigned to prepare the guest room, which gave her legitimate access. While Walsh was at dinner, she entered his room and left a letter on his pillow, partially hidden under the coverlet, where he'd find it when retiring for the night. The letter was brief, unsigned, written carefully. Sir, a Christian man who preaches against corruption might wish to know that great corruption exists in Robertson County, involving theft of property, manipulation of courts, and destruction of innocent people. Detailed information is available from someone who has witnessed and can recount specific acts with complete accuracy. If you wish to learn more, walk past the large oak tree at the east property boundary at dawn Thursday. Come alone. This concerns matters of justice that may interest a man of God. Walsh found the letter that night. He read it by candlelight. His expression, according to what he later told others, troubled and uncertain. Anonymous letters could be traps, could be tests of his character, could be attempts to embarrass him or create scandal. But he was also genuinely committed to justice, genuinely troubled by the corruption he'd witnessed in Tennessee, and curious about what information might be available. At dawn on Thursday, he walked to the east boundary oak tree as if taking a morning constitutional. Eliza stepped out from behind the tree trunk. Walsh's first reaction was visible shock. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't a 21-year-old enslaved woman with one blue eye and one brown eye, looking at him with an intensity that made clear this was no prank or mistake. "You wrote the letter," he said quietly. "Yes, sir," Eliza replied. "I can write. I can read. And I can remember everything I've heard in this house for 15 years, everything about 12 men who control this county through corruption, theft, and manipulation of courts. Everything with dates, names, amounts, specific details." Walsh stared at her. "That's an extraordinary claim." "Test me," Eliza said. "Your sermon Tuesday night. You preached from Matthew chapter 7 about false prophets and corrupt trees bearing corrupt fruit. You started by describing a thunderstorm you witnessed in Nashville that damaged a church steeple, using it as metaphor for God's judgment. You quoted Matthew 7:17 through 7:20. You gave 4 specific examples of corruption: merchants using false weights, lenders charging illegal interest, judges taking bribes, and politicians selling offices. You closed by quoting Micah 6:8 about doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. Your sermon lasted 37 minutes. Should I continue with exact quotes?" Walsh's face had gone pale. You couldn't possibly." "I can," Eliza said. "I remember everything. Every conversation, every detail, every scheme these men have discussed in front of me because they assume enslaved people can't understand or remember. I've heard them plan murders, discuss property thefts, coordinate court cases, destroy families. I can testify to all of it with complete accuracy." She paused, then added the crucial part. "I'm being sold to Mississippi in 8 weeks. If that happens, everything I know disappears with me. But if someone could help me secure legal freedom, I would provide detailed testimony that could expose corruption across this entire county." Reverend Walsh stood silent for a long moment. The dawn was breaking over the tobacco fields, light spreading across a landscape built on injustice that men like him preached against but rarely confronted directly. "What you're proposing is dangerous," he finally said. "For you and for anyone who helps you." "I know," Eliza replied. "But Grace Thornhill burned to death in 1830 so these men could steal her land. Catherine Morrison died poor in Nashville because they stole her inheritance. Dozens of families have lost everything to fraudulent foreclosures. Someone needs to speak. I can speak. I just need to live long enough to do it." Walsh asked her one more question, the question that would determine everything. "Why should I believe your memory is as accurate as you claim? Memory is fallible. People misremember, especially under stress or after years have passed." Eliza recited his entire Tuesday sermon, word for word, including the biblical passages, the examples, the metaphors, the emphasis he'd placed on certain phrases, his exact closing prayer. She spoke for 37 minutes, reproducing his sermon with such precision that Walsh later said it felt like hearing his own voice played back to him. When she finished, Walsh was silent for nearly a minute. "That's not a normal gift," he finally said, his voice shaken. "No, sir," Eliza agreed, "but what I've been forced to witness isn't normal either. It's evil disguised as law, and someone needs to expose it." Walsh told her he needed time to pray and consider. She told him she had 8 weeks before being sold south and silenced forever. He returned to the plantation house, spent the day in visible contemplation, preached that evening about justice and the courage required to confront powerful wrongdoing, and departed Friday morning with no indication of his decision. 5 days later, Eliza received a message through Sarah, her mother, who'd been approached by a free black man who occasionally did work at the plantation. The message was simple. The preacher believes you. Help is being arranged. Stay ready. Reverend Walsh had gone to Nashville and told select people about a young woman with an extraordinary memory who'd witnessed years of corruption and was willing to testify if her freedom could be secured. He'd contacted attorneys who'd been looking for evidence to challenge the power structures in counties like Robertson. He'd approached members of anti-slavery societies who'd been funding freedom purchases and legal defenses. He'd spoken with newspaper editors interested in exposing plantation elite corruption. The response had been immediate and coordinated. Money was quietly raised from multiple sources. Legal strategies were developed. Protection arrangements were planned. On July 5, 1845, 2 days before Eliza was scheduled to be handed over to William Hatcher for transport south, James Harwell Jr. received an unexpected visitor at the plantation. A Nashville attorney named Samuel Porterfield, representing an anti-slavery society, made an offer. $2,200 for Eliza's freedom, money to be paid immediately in cash, manumission papers to be processed through Davidson County courts rather than Robertson County to avoid complications. The offer was presented as simple Christian charity, a religious organization purchasing and freeing an enslaved person as an act of piety. Such transactions weren't uncommon in Tennessee during this period and were generally legal, though sometimes socially controversial. James Jr. saw only the money, $250 more than Hatcher had agreed to pay. Immediate cash that would partially offset his investment losses and restore some confidence from association members. He negotiated briefly, secured $300, and signed the papers that same day. The transaction was processed through Nashville courts within a week. Eliza Harwell became a free woman on July 12, 1845. She was transferred to a Nashville guardian, a widow named Mrs. Elizabeth Crane, who was sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause and agreed to provide housing and legal protection. By the time James Harwell Jr. fully understood what had happened, Eliza was in Nashville, beyond Robertson County jurisdiction, under legal protection, and beginning to meet with attorneys who were preparing cases that would eventually involve multiple courts across Tennessee. The realization swept through the Springfield Association like panic. James Jr. called an emergency meeting on July 18th. All 12 men gathered at the Harwell plantation on a hot evening. Mosquitoes swarming outside, tension thick inside the main house. The conversation, later reconstructed through testimony from a house servant who overheard portions, was frantic. They'd lost control of their living archive. 20 years of carefully hidden corruption might be exposed because James Jr. had sold away the one person who could destroy them all. Robert Killebrew demanded to know how James Jr. could have been so stupid. Edward Vance suggested they might be able to challenge the manumission papers on technical grounds. Judge Thornton pointed out that even if they did, she was in Davidson County now, where different judges presided and their influence was limited. Marcus Pettiford, the attorney, spoke the truth they all understood. She's legally free. She's under protection in Nashville, and she knows everything, every fraudulent deed, every manipulated case, every foreclosure, every scheme we've discussed for 20 years. If she testifies, we're finished. Someone suggested buying her silence. Someone else pointed out that she'd already chosen to speak rather than disappear into Mississippi slavery. She wasn't going to be bought. Someone mentioned more extreme solutions. The suggestion was immediately shouted down. Violence against a legally free woman in Nashville under public protection would bring exactly the attention they needed to avoid. They were trapped. The system they'd built to protect themselves, legal manipulation, coordinated influence, careful avoidance of written evidence, had become their vulnerability. Because they'd hidden everything, there were no official records they could point to as innocent explanations. Because they'd corrupted Robertson County's courts so thoroughly, their claims of innocence wouldn't be credible anywhere else. James Harwell Jr. understood, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, that he'd made a catastrophic mistake born of arrogance and desperation. His face, according to the servant who witnessed it, had gone gray as ash. The question one of them asked, "History doesn't record who," hung in the air like humidity. What do we do now? No one had an answer, because there was no answer. They'd operated above consequence for 20 years, and now consequence was coming for them with perfect memory and legal protection. The Springfield Association, in that moment, was already destroyed. They just didn't know it yet. What followed over the next 3 years became known in Tennessee legal circles as the Robertson County cases, though newspapers eventually called it the Springfield corruption scandal. The legal proceedings were complex, involving multiple jurisdictions, multiple types of cases, and eventually drawing attention from as far away as New York and Boston, where abolitionist newspapers seized on the story as evidence of systemic corruption in slave states. Eliza's testimony began in September 1845 in Davidson County Court in a property restoration case brought by the surviving children of Grace Thornhill. The Thornhill heirs had tried for years to challenge the seizure of their mother's land, but lacked evidence to overcome the documentation that Marcus Pettiford had filed and Judge Thornton had validated. Eliza provided that evidence. She testified that on August 14, 1830, she'd heard the Springfield Association discuss plans to force Grace Thornhill off her land. She recounted the conversation with devastating precision. What each man said, what strategies they discussed, how they'd coordinated the creation of false debt documentation. She described how Marcus Pettiford had explained his approach to manufacturing legal grounds for seizure, how Judge Thornton had assured the others he'd validate the claim without scrutiny, how Edward Vance had already identified the property as desirable for acquisition. Defense attorneys objected strenuously. An enslaved person's testimony, even someone subsequently freed, shouldn't be admissible against white men in property disputes. The objection was overruled. Eliza was legally free at the time of testimony, and Davidson County courts operated under slightly different precedents than rural counties. They challenged her memory. How could anyone remember exact quotes from 15 years prior? The judge allowed Eliza to demonstrate. She recited, word for word, opening statements from both attorneys that had been given 2 days earlier. Court stenographers confirmed her accuracy was perfect. She provided details that could be checked against records, dates of specific court filings, amounts mentioned in debt claims, names of witnesses who testified in the original foreclosure case. Where records still existed, her testimony matched. Where records had been conveniently lost, the pattern of convenient loss itself suggested accuracy of her claims about manipulation. The case lasted 3 weeks. The verdict came in October. The Thornhill property seizure had been based on fraudulent documentation. The land was to be restored to Grace Thornhill's heirs with damages. But that was only the beginning. Other families who'd lost property to association foreclosures came forward with attorneys, funded by anti-slavery societies and political opponents of plantation power structures. Case after case was filed through late 1845 and into 1846. Eliza testified in 11 separate proceedings, each time providing detailed accounts of conversations she'd overheard about specific properties, specific schemes, specific coordinated manipulations. Edward Vance's land speculation empire collapsed as property after property was reclaimed. His documented holdings, those he'd actually purchased legitimately, were sold to pay judgments and legal fees. By 1847, he'd fled Tennessee entirely, relocating to Texas where he died in 1852, bankrupt and disgraced. Jefferson Cunningham faced criminal investigation for banking fraud based on Eliza's testimony about loan manipulation practices. She described specific conversations where Cunningham had explained how he structured loans to guarantee foreclosure, how he'd coordinated with other association members to trap farmers in debt cycles. The investigation lasted 8 months. Cunningham was forced to resign from the bank in 1846, faced civil penalties, but avoided criminal conviction through legal maneuvering. He died in Nashville in 1850. his reputation destroyed. Samuel Batson's cotton gin operation was sued by 37 farmers who'd been systematically cheated through falsified weight measurements and manipulated pricing. Eliza testified that she'd heard Batson describe his methods in detail during association meetings. Court-ordered audits found discrepancies in Batson's records that supported her testimony. His business never recovered. He sold the gin operation in 1847 for a fraction of its previous value. William Greer was removed from his position in the county land office after Eliza's testimony revealed his role in manipulating property records and providing inside information to association members. He faced criminal charges for falsification of public records. The trial ended in a hung jury, but his career was finished. He moved to Mississippi in 1848. One by one, through 1845, 1846, and into 1847, the 12 families faced legal challenges, financial collapse, and public exposure. Some fought desperately with their own attorneys and remaining political connections. Some fled to other states, abandoning property and starting over where their names weren't yet associated with scandal. Some, like James Harwell Jr., simply collapsed under the accumulated weight. The Harwell plantation was foreclosed on in 1846 when James Jr. couldn't meet debts he'd taken on trying to fight the legal challenges. The property was seized by creditors and sold at auction. James Jr. disappeared from Tennessee, last documented in Arkansas Territory in 1849, working as a clerk in a trading post, his inheritance and future destroyed by his own arrogance and his catastrophic decision to sell the one person who could destroy him. The legal battle reached its climax in May 1847 during a consolidated criminal trial in Nashville that attempted to address the most serious charges against association members: conspiracy to defraud, falsification of court documents, and bribery of public officials. The trial lasted 3.5 weeks, drawing spectators from across Tennessee and journalists from multiple states. Eliza testified for 6 full days, examined and cross-examined repeatedly. She sat in the witness box with her distinctive mismatched eyes fixed on the jury, and she methodically dismantled 2 decades of carefully hidden corruption. She recounted specific conversations with exact dates. She described the physical locations where conversations occurred. She named names and quoted exact phrases. She explained the connections between seemingly unrelated events, showing how various schemes had been coordinated. Defense attorneys challenged her relentlessly. They brought witnesses who claimed she was mistaken about certain details. But when those details were checked against other evidence, Eliza's account proved accurate more often than her challenges. They argued that her testimony couldn't be trusted because of the impossible nature of her memory. But court officials had tested her extensively, and her demonstrated ability to recall complex information with perfect accuracy was now well established in the record. They tried to claim that her unusual eyes indicated mental instability, bringing in a doctor from New York who speculated about possible connections between heterochromia and various neurological conditions. The prosecution countered with 3 other doctors who testified that eye color had no established relationship to mental capacity or memory function, and that Eliza had been examined by physicians who found her completely mentally sound. They attempted to discredit her motives, suggesting she'd been coached by abolitionists seeking to manufacture scandal. But the specificity of her testimony, details about events from years before anyone knew she'd eventually testify, made coaching impossible to explain. The trial ended with mixed verdicts on June 17, 1847. Judge Benjamin Thornton was convicted of judicial misconduct and removed from the bench, though he avoided prison time. Marcus Pettiford was disbarred and faced civil penalties, but no criminal conviction. Several others were convicted of lesser charges, paying fines or facing brief jail terms. The legal system, even when confronting corruption, protected its own to some degree. Many serious charges resulted in acquittals or mistrials. Wealthy men with good attorneys could still navigate outcomes better than the evidence might warrant, but the practical impact went far beyond the criminal verdicts. The Springfield Association was utterly destroyed, as a functioning entity. The 12 families who'd controlled Robertson County for 2 decades found their power broken, their reputations shattered, their financial empires reduced to wreckage. Properties were sold to pay legal fees and court judgments. Political careers ended abruptly, social standing evaporated overnight. And throughout Middle Tennessee, people understood what had happened. A woman they'd dismissed as property, whose unusual gift they'd exploited without ever imagining it could be turned against them, had brought down 12 of the most powerful men in the region through nothing more than memory and truth. The word "cursed" began circulating in Robertson County, spoken in hushed tones in parlors and church socials. The woman with 2 different colored eyes had cursed 12 families, bringing ruin wherever her gaze had fallen. But Eliza Harwell had never needed curses or supernatural power. She'd needed only memory, patience, courage, and the opportunity to finally speak what she'd been forced to witness in silence. Eliza Harwell lived another 26 years after the trials concluded. Her life from 1847 until her death in 1873 remained largely private, deliberately so. She'd spent 3 years in public view, testifying repeatedly, her face and story known across Tennessee and beyond. What came after was a conscious retreat from that visibility. What is known comes from fragmentary records, census data, occasional mentions in Nashville newspapers, court documents from a few later cases, and oral history passed down through families, though those accounts are difficult to verify and often contradict each other. She never returned to Robertson County. That much is certain. The $50 she received from the Tennessee Anti-Slavery Society that had funded her freedom, combined with small payments from several families who'd reclaimed property based on her testimony, allowed her to establish a modest but stable life in Nashville's free black community. She married in September 1849 to David Porter, a freed carpenter who'd purchased his own freedom in 1843. Their marriage was recorded in Davidson County. They had 3 children who survived to adulthood. Sarah, born 1850, who became a school teacher. Thomas, born 1852, who learned carpentry from his father. And Elizabeth, born 1855, who married a Nashville merchant and lived until 1921. Census records from 1850, 1860, and 1870 show Eliza listed as a laundress, a domestic occupation that was common among free black women in Nashville. The work was hard but allowed independence and didn't require her to work in white households where her face and history might be recognized. But there are hints in court records that her unusual memory continued to serve a purpose. Several legal cases in Davidson County during the 1850s featured testimony from an unnamed woman who provided detailed historical information about property transactions and business dealings from years prior. The descriptions of her appearance in court transcripts, when they appear, invariably mention distinctive eyes of different colors. She continued to bear witness when called upon, but she did so quietly, without drawing attention, speaking only when her testimony was necessary and then returning to her private life. The 12 families of the Springfield Association scattered and diminished. Some descendants remained in Tennessee, bearing surnames that had once commanded respect, but now carried associations with scandal and corruption. Robert Killebrew's grandson changed the family name to Kilbourne and moved to Kentucky in 1869. Daniel Yateman's children relocated to Alabama. Thomas Whitley's son sold the family mercantile in 1851 and moved to St. Louis. Others simply faded from records, their family lines ending or becoming untraceable. Alexander Darden died in 1849. His slave auction business had collapsed in 1846, and he'd lived his last years in poverty in Springfield. Henry Cartwright sold his tobacco warehouse in 1848 and moved to New Orleans, where he died in a yellow fever epidemic in 1853. Robertson County itself changed slowly. New people moved in, bought properties that had been seized or sold. The political structure shifted as the old power networks collapsed and new ones formed. It wasn't transformation toward justice. The system that had allowed the Springfield Association to flourish remained largely intact. built on slavery and inequality that would require a war to begin addressing. But the specific constellation of coordinated corruption that Eliza had helped expose did not reform in Robertson County. The memory of what happened, the public scandal, served as at least temporary deterrent. The courthouse fire of 1891 destroyed many records from the 1840s. The fire started around 2 a.m. on March 7th in the record storage room where the oldest documents were kept. By the time Springfield's volunteer fire brigade responded, the entire west wing of the courthouse was engulfed. The fire burned for 3 hours. Damage was extensive. Hundreds of documents from Robertson County's early history were lost. An investigation called the fire's cause undetermined but possibly incendiary. No arrests were ever made. Some historians believe it was simply an accident. Old buildings, inadequate fire safety, a combination of unfortunate circumstances. Others note that the documents destroyed included detailed trial transcripts and depositions containing damaging information about families whose descendants still held influence in Middle Tennessee in 1891. What survived the fire were fragments. Newspaper accounts from the 1840s, scattered legal documents that had been filed in other counties, family stories passed down through generations. Each version shaped by who was telling it and what they wanted, remembered or forgotten. The question of what actually happened remains debated by local historians even now. Some claim the whole scandal was exaggerated, that Eliza's memory was unreliable, that she was manipulated by political enemies of the association who used her as a weapon in larger power struggles. Others point to the evidence. 12 prominent families experienced simultaneous collapse following testimony that proved accurate enough to convince multiple courts and juries in an era when the legal system was overwhelmingly biased in favor of white male property owners. The pattern suggests the testimony was credible, the corruption real, the destruction earned. Eliza herself left no written memoir, no personal account of her experiences. Whether by choice or necessity, whether she was protecting herself or simply wanted to move forward rather than look back, no one can say with certainty.